This sermon is, I had to know. Paul had to know what was going on. He needed to know, and of course he couldn't text them or any of those things. People love conspiracy theories, and it touches every group of people. People who don't go to church think that the pastor just takes whatever's in the offering plate and it all goes to him. They have no idea that there's expenses for the church and heat and lights and paint and missionaries to give to. They just think that's it. That's their form of conspiracy theory. People think that the vaccine has a microchip in it, that you get the vaccine in it and the people, it's in your arm and the government to track you. And it sounds really crazy, of course, but they do put microchips in some of your clothing. So there might be a microchip in here, sewn into just into the fabric, and as you walk into the store, the microchip is picked up and they know who bought it. The funny thing, of course, is that how are they going to figure out, because I got this at Salvation Army or some other place. It's used. They're not going to get the right person when they're chipped. So I figured they must know a way to get around that, maybe. If you go onto Google and you search for something, almost immediately in your Facebook or on YouTube, there's advertisements relating to that product. It's an algorithm they built in. We sold some doors to a guy. He's a computer technologist, a computer engineer. And he says to me earlier this week, Peter, I don't have a cell phone, and I don't have the computer hooked up to the internet. I don't want them to know anything about my things. And I was driving down the road, and as I drove by places, an advertisement for that place would appear on my phone. And I said, they know too much about me. They know exactly where I am, and I'm coming up to this place. So he said, that was it. I just got rid of it. Well, that's now. But what must have been like thousands of years ago? I remember the story of Abraham sent off his servant to find Isaac a wife, and he found Rebekah. And Rebekah said, yes, I want to go, knowing full well that she would never see her family again, knowing that there was no way to tell them that it all had worked out, that it was all wonderful. None of that. Off she went, and that was it. What must that have been like? I was listening to an interview, small clip of an interview, and it was the president of one of the Central American countries complaining. He was having a meeting with Kamala Harris, the vice president, and he was complaining that the United States has this policy that says if you have somebody from your family living in the U.S., they could be an anchor person and you can bring the rest. And so the coyotes, the people who smuggle people, are telling people down there, all you have to do is send your child. Once they get to America, they can bring you. And he says, you've got to stop that. You're the problem. You're the problem. That's why so many people are going. Can you imagine, though, sending them off with a coyote, with a human smuggler, not knowing what was going to happen, not knowing if they would make it, not knowing if they would live, hoping against hope that you would get that call because the human smuggler said you put your phone number in their pocket, and when they're arrested, they'll have a phone number and they'll call you. What can you imagine it would be like waiting for that telephone call? And what must it have been like when there was no such thing as telephone calls, and you knew that once your child left and you saw them go to a dot in the horizon, that was the last time you'd ever see them. That was what Paul was struggling with. He knew. And He was having a problem with that. Now, a person who thinks about conspiracy theories is worrying about, because he hasn't got really anything else to worry about. There's enough food to buy. He has a home to live in. The government isn't coming to arrest him. And he really doesn't have anything important to worry about. So he has to find something else to worry about, and it's all sorts of crazy things. The worst of these people are called tinfoil hat people. Now, tinfoil hat people are people who believe that the government is sending signals through the air and they're brainwashing you. And so they wear the tinfoil, which keeps the signals away. Of course, that's unreasonable. And the other thing is, God tells you not to worry. He says don't worry, because when you worry, it's a way of saying to God, I know that you can handle lots of stuff, but my problems you're not a big enough God to handle. That's true, and of course it's not true. God can handle anything. So what do we do with this obvious and clear statement in verse 1 and verse 5, where Paul says he couldn't stand it any longer? We could not endure it any longer. It's obviously something called worry. Now, we should look at this and figure out, is this really an example of Paul not trusting God to look after the people of Thessalonica when he wasn't there? And what do we make of that decision to stop the obvious continuation of the mission tour in Athens to send back Timothy? Well, I think it would be a good idea to look back in Acts. It's in Acts 17, verse 1, about what happened in Thessalonica. It says here, now when we had traveled through, I'm not going to say a couple cities, and they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews, and according to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I'm proclaiming to you, is the Christ. For some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of God-fearing Greeks and a number of leading women. Now I'm going to read verse 5, but I want to go like this and explain to you that in the Bible, some accounts are compressed and some are stretched. We know that Simon, or Stephen, was stoned, and they have a whole chapter and a half about that. It's stretched. But this particular account is compressed. And it says in verse 5, but the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason. They were seeking to bring them out to the people. And then in verse 10 it says, and the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away at night to Berea. And if you continue reading, you'll recognize that they went to Berea and they were noble-minded more than the people in Thessalonica, and they received the word and they believed. And in verse 13 it says, when the Jews of Thessalonica found out about the word of God was being proclaimed, they sent people to stir up the crowds, and immediately the brethren sent Paul off to Athens. And in verse 15, he said, send off Timothy and Silas. Now, in the commentaries, it says, even though it says for 3 weeks, it was probably more like 4 to 6 months that they stayed. They spent 3 weeks in the synagogue, but it was probably 4 to 6 months before they were, the Jews got up to this resistance and oppression of the church. But even if you say it's 4 to 6 months, you can imagine, you've started a new church with people who have never heard of Jesus or the gospel or other than the fact that there are Jews living in the city, and you only have 4 to 6 months to start a church, and that's a really short time to change people's behavior that had taken a lifetime to generate, and it was also encouraged by the culture around them. And on top of that, they probably all worked, and Paul, as was his custom, worked too. So they would only have a few hours in the evening and the Sabbath for him to be able to speak to them about Jesus and the strength in the church. Then they were chased away to Berea, and from there on they went to Athens. Now, Paul also said that they tried. If you look at 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 17, it says, "But we, brethren, having been taken away from you for a short while, in person, not in spirit, with all the more eager, with great desire to see your face, for we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, more than once, and then Satan hindered us." Now, I think that every time that Satan hindered him from coming, it just created more tension, and his level of concern would go up a notch or two, and when he couldn't stand that tension any longer, he said, "That's it, I have to send Timothy." It seems that the devil was choosing to interfere with Paul, and if you think about it, Paul was the big fish and Timothy was his helper, and the devil didn't interfere with Timothy going. He stayed around and interfered with Paul. Now, I was listening to a pastor, and he had something interesting to say about the devil. He said that we give the devil too much credit, and in doing so, we give ourselves too much credit. What he was saying was, we say, well, the devil was interfering with me, or the devil was tempting me, and he said, God is all present, he's omnipresent, he knows everything, he knows all your thoughts. From the time before you were born, he knows every human's thoughts, even the ones that aren't born yet. But the devil doesn't do that. The devil doesn't know all those things. He is a created being, and we give him too much credit. He's not like God. He doesn't know the lilies of the field and the sparrows and all those things. And my guess is he doesn't even know our name, because he's limited. Though he did know the name of Paul, and he knew the name of the apostles, and he interfered with them on a regular basis. And the reason he did was, every time Paul preached, he got beaten up. He lost ground. We may have some minor demon interfering with us, but not the devil. Well, Paul was a threat to the devil, and everywhere he went, as I said, the devil lost ground. But it came at a cost to Paul, a cost in stoning and beatings and this continuous worry about the Christians who he could never stay long enough to help them get the full story. Because he understood that these Christians had all sorts of things that from their past. They may have owned slaves. We know that Onesimus owned a slave, Philemon. We know that, or Philemon owned Onesimus, but and we know that they would have more than one wife, and they may have had a mistress. And what does a Christian do with all these things? And inquiring minds would like to know. And there's also lots of things that we won't even mention, that we would say, oh, I don't want to hear about stuff like that. But those were common sins that were going on in a place like Thessalonica. And so Paul was leaving, knowing that they were going to struggle with this guilt. It says that he hoped that the tempter wouldn't pull them away and our labor would in vain, in verse 5. Understanding that one of the things that the devil does is try to convince you that God will really not save you. Those sins are not forgiven at all. Well, this and all these other reasons why Paul was worried. And so I think we should look at the passage. Number one is, why, yes, I am worried. In verse 1 to 5 it says, therefore, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to leave behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy our brother, and God's fellow worker in the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you in your faith, so that no one would be disturbed by these afflictions, for you yourself know that we were destined for this. For indeed, when we were with you, we kept telling you in advance that we're going to suffer afflictions, and so it came to pass, as you know. For this reason I could endure it no longer. I also sent to find out about your faith, for fear that the tempter might have tempted you and our labors would have been in vain. On the face of this, as we read verse 1 and verse 5, you would say that Paul was worried, and his worrying was affecting those with him. We have something here in the West that people of his time didn't have. We can learn how our family is doing. My daughter, my youngest daughter, had struggling with vertigo, and she texted Wanda last night that she'd had a good day. She hadn't had a headache. You see, we got that information immediately, and if Wanda had wanted to more details, she could have called her. She could have had a Zoom call, and we could have seen her face. They don't have any of that. We can find out whether they're struggling physically or mentally or emotionally or spiritually. And the problem is with the church, they only got rumors. You see, they would have had that rumor when they went off from Thessalonica to Berea, and then the church, or the Jews sent people from Thessalonica to Berea and sent them off. That would have come back to them, and they would have worried, and they would have said, the church at Thessalonica would have said, well, what happened to them? Where did they go? Are they all right? They would fear that the one who'd come to share the gospel with them was in trouble, and why wasn't the God who was all-powerful protecting him and his companions? Well, Paul reminded them, in the same way that Jesus was persecuted, that they would be persecuted too. So, they shouldn't think that this was unusual. Now, you see, what was happening is, every time Paul reminded them that Satan was losing the battle, to continue to be the ruler of this world. Now, in the Old Testament, Satan was referred to as the ruler of this world. And in John, Jesus referred to him. In John 12:31, it says, now judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast down. And in 14:30, it says, and I will not speak much more with you, for the ruler of this world is coming, he has nothing on me. And in verse 16 and verse 11, chapter 16, and concerning judgment, because of the ruler of this world has been judged. Jesus called him the ruler of this world, but that was to shortly change. He was going to get a severe beating. When Jesus died on the cross and rose again, that title was no longer his. It was a death blow. I don't know if you remember the show called Sanford and Sons. He's a black guy, and anytime anybody told him something he didn't want to hear, he went like this, and he staggered back like he was going to die. Well, Satan hasn't died, but he's received a death blow that will eventually put him away, because that's what happened when Jesus rose again. And he loses more every day. Now, a pastor was giving an illustration, and he said, I'm going to say a word, and you're going to say the opposite. And he said white, and people would say black. He said rich, people said poor. He said pretty, people said ugly. And then he said God, and people continued on and said the devil. But that's not right. When you say God, there is no answer to that. God has no equal. He created all things. Satan is more powerful than us, but he's still a created being. He still answers to God. If you remember the story of Job, he couldn't do anything to Job without God's specific allowing him to do so, and he only could go so far, and then he had to stop. You see, God can say at any instant, your rule of earth, your dominion of earth is done. In Revelations it says that that's going to happen one day. That's what Satan is going to happen to Satan. Well, let's look at number 2. Back with the news. We've just, verse 6. And now when Timothy has come to us from you, and has brought the good news of your faith and love, and that you always think kindly of us, longing to see us, just as we also long to see you. For this reason, brethren, in all our distress and affliction, we were comforted about you through your faith. For now we really live if you stand firm in the Lord. Do you remember I talked about this stretching and shrinking the narrative? Well, between verse 5 and verse 6, Timothy is gone, and his whole point was to go. If you read we sent Timothy, verse 2 says, to strengthen and encourage you in your faith. That was probably another 6 months. We don't know that. But he probably was gone 6 months, and then he came back. Though between 5 and 6 was squished into a small little area. I expect he stayed preaching. As I read this, I thought to myself, this doesn't seem like Paul. That's not a picture we usually have of Paul, a person who needed stroked. Now, that word is an insult. If you have a cat, you know that the cat will come and you're sitting in your chair reading a book, and the cat will jump up on your lap and get right on the book, and he'll have to be stroked. You'll have to pat him, and you'll pat him, and he'll feel better, and then he'll leave. Well, Paul doesn't seem like, we read all through Acts of Paul's journeys and all through his letters, and he didn't seem like a person who required to be stroked. There are people like that, and there are people that are like that sometimes. I was reading the book of a pastor called Don Piper. Don Piper was coming from a conference, and he was coming across a bridge, and he was in a terrible accident, and he was killed. And an hour and a half later, he was still in his car. They were waiting for the hearse to come and take him away, and the coroner to declare him dead. And another pastor from the same conference came on and said, I'd like to pray for him. And he crawled into what was left of the car, in through the back of it, and he put his hand on him, and he started to pray for him, and he started to move. And he was alive. He'd been dead, and declared dead by the people who were in the ambulance an hour and a half ago. Now, the reason I tell you this story is he was badly injured. Pieces of the bones in his arm were just gone, smashed and gone, and in his legs. And when that happens, what they do is they put you in traction, and they put the bones together. So the bones are together, and they start to knit. And the traction is, they turn that nut, one turn, and it pulls that healing apart. And it continues to heal, and every day it's like they're pulling the scab off. And it's excruciatingly painful. And what happened was, during this excruciating pain, he could think of no one else. It was all about him, and it was all about his pain. No one else's pain mattered. It was so severe that he wrote it in the book, and he understood that he was being extremely selfish, but there was nothing he had no other thoughts. It was only him and his pain. He had nothing else to think about. Well, this was not a self-centered man. He was a pastor and a man who'd spent 90 minutes in heaven. But he understood that because of all this, he was self-centered. But that wasn't Paul. His worry was about them and how they were making out. Do you remember last week I told you about this Korean woman, North Korean woman who had escaped from North Korea? Now, when I say a woman and my daughter's 6 feet tall, she would probably be this tall. Very small, 60 pounds. Anyway, she escaped to China, and she became a slave, and her mother was a slave, and the Christians there saved her. And they were going to help her escape through Mongolia and into South Korea. So they didn't have enough clothes. They were told to pack really light. There was 8 of them, 1 a 2-year-old boy. And it was -40 in Mongolia. It was just absolute. They should have frozen in minutes, but they didn't. They all made it through. Without gloves, without hats, they made it through. And the only thing you can say is those Christians that sent them were so worried and were continuously holding them up before God for their safety. That's why they didn't die. You would think little small people, under 5 feet tall, 60, 65, 70 pounds, and a baby would have died. But they all survived. Well, that was Paul too, pestering God about the people in Thessalonica continuously about their struggle in the faith. Now, when I say pester, it's the wrong word. God is infinite, and we can pray to him 24 hours a day if we could stay awake, and it would be okay. And we could ask God for as much grace as he could possibly give for somebody, a fellow Christian. God, I want you to give him grace. And God's not offended by that. Now, if I said, I want you to give him a new car and a bigger house and lots of money, God would say that's not a proper prayer. But asking for grace for somebody, Paul said, my grace is sufficient for you. He was talking about, God was saying to him, my grace is sufficient when he had that thorn in the flesh. My grace is sufficient for you. You can imagine how much grace Paul needed. Well, Paul was saying in the last verse I read, that his joy was multiplied when they found out that they were doing well because of his great love for them. And I thought to myself, you know, this isn't regular, ordinary love. It's not a selfish love. This is not a natural love, it's a supernatural love, gift from God to be able to love somebody. is something that we could pray for, to have that kind of love for those people who are our Christian brothers and sisters. Well, number 3 is such abounding joy. Verse 9 and 10 says, "For what thanks can we render to God for you in return for all the joy with which we rejoice before our God on your account? And we night and day keep praying more earnestly that we may see your face and may complete what is lacking in your faith." I said earlier that Paul was hard-pressed to come up with the words that were good enough for a thank you. We give out thank you. There's Harlequin cards, and they have thank you cards, but they wouldn't be good enough. There would be no card you could pick off the rack at Shoppers that would be enough thankful card enough to thank God for all the goodness He had bestowed on these people. Well, what must it have been like to be loved to that extent that he had no words to express to God that they were, how grateful he was that they were okay. And he wanted badly to go to them and help them because he knew he'd left without finishing the job. He was there, and then they'd come to stir up the city, and the church had sent them away. It saved him, but it cost them dearly, because in saving his life, they risked the fact that there was no one there to share the gospel with them in all the other things that needed to be said. And it's in a parent's nature to worry about their children. And Paul was the child of this church. He was the father of this church. They were his children in the faith. He called them that. Well, what can we do with all this thing about worry? Is it appropriate? Or was it something that... Well, the answer is that I think this worry was appropriate. And it wasn't something that Paul did a lot of. Or if he did, he took that concern to God in prayer. He didn't worry about himself, because if he had worried about himself, he wouldn't have done all these crazy things. All these things that God told him to do, and he would have to say, no, God, I can't do those, I'm too worried. Dennis Prager is a Jewish man, and he's gone to Israel 27 times. And his friends who said, yes, I want to go to Israel, I want to go to Jerusalem, I want to do all those things, but I'm going to wait till it's safe. And he said, you know what? You're never going to go. It's never going to be safe enough. If you're going to do something, you have to take the risk that's necessary. All adventures carry some risk. And without risk, there's nothing important that can be done. There's a saying that you all know. It's William Carey said, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. Now, not all those great things you attempt will succeed, but that's not important. The important thing is to step out in faith, recognizing that when you step out in faith, there's nothing there to put your foot on. But in the faith, God, between the time when you put your foot out, God will put something there. That's the point of faith. God says, you step out in faith, and I'll make sure that this happens for you. This works out. Dennis Prager was talking about this, how you have to, you can't be scared and not do something. So when he was 7 years old, his mom and dad decided that he was going to go visit his aunt. They lived in New York, and she lived in another city, Philadelphia or somewhere. And so they brought him to the airport, and they hugged him and waved him, and he went down the corridor toward the plane. And he found a seat, and at that time, 50, 60 years ago, the stewardess didn't look after you. They pointed you to the seat, you sat there, and then he arrived in Philadelphia, and he went down that corridor, and his aunt was waiting. and he spent 6 weeks there. And she put him on the plane, and down the corridor he went. He sat on the plane and got back to New York and came off out the corridor, and his parents weren't there. They didn't come to pick him up. So he's 7 years old. And so what does he do? Well, he goes to look for his luggage. And he finds his luggage, and his parents he said this is one of their favorite stories. They were late, caught in traffic, arrived a half an hour later, and they came into the airport, and here he is standing by a porter, and he's got his wallet out, and he's giving a tip to the porter for carrying his luggage at 7 years old. Great story, right? And any time his mother started to worry about him, his father would say, "What are you going to do? Keep him in the china closet?" And he had no idea what a china closet was. He thought it was some room in China. And the whole point of it was that you need to take risks. Well, Paul was worried, and in spite of his prayer, God hadn't given him peace about it, and so he sent off Timothy to do what he couldn't do himself. Now, he used what he had at hand, and he risked his friend, the health and welfare of his friend, to help another group. Now, Jesus said this, "No greater love than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." There's an amazing sacrifice, but there's more to it than that. We say, you lay down your life for your friend, but we want more. We want you to lay down your life for our friend. It's not your friend, it's our friend. If you want an illustration of that, think of this fictional place in the world where a soldier is on the border. He's a guard. And if ever someone gets past him and gets into the country, he's killed. He loses his life. And you know him, he's your friend, and you come to him and say, "I have a friend on the other side of the border, and I want him to get through. He's not a very good friend, you don't know him, and he's not a very good person, but I want you to let him through. How about it? Will you? Will you let him through?" And you know that if he says yes, he will be killed. Well, that's what Jesus did for us. And that's what Jesus will do for our friends when we pray for them. How about it? Will you save him? This is what Paul did for the people of Thessalonica. "Lord, Jesus, will you save them too? How about it? I know you're my friend, but what about these?" Well, now that Jesus had saved them, it was Paul's job to train them up in the way that they should go. But he left the job before it was finished. Stuff happened, and he left the city with the job undone. Now, here's what I wish. I wish that we could be as worried as he was. We could be as worried about the people in this area as he was worried about the people of Thessalonica. We could say to God, "Jesus, I want you to finish the job." They've got some of the information. They know about salvation. They know that their need for you, but they haven't got all the information. And Lord, I want you to make it possible for them to get the rest. If we can say that kind of worry, I'm sure God will appreciate and approve of it. Let's pray. Lord,